When the French explorer Samuel de Champlain stepped into the dense, fertile heart of Ontario in the late summer of 1615, he did not plant a silk flag and unilaterally claim a savage wilderness for a European king. He stood before a towering, triple-walled wooden palisade that reached 35 feet into the sky, complete with defensive galleries and watchtowers. He walked into a heavily fortified, deeply entrenched city, housing thousands of indigenous people, took off his hat in a forced, diplomatic bow, and recognized a cold reality. The French were not conquerors. They were junior partners, asking for an alliance. We are fed a comfortable, highly sanitized, and entirely false narrative that Europeans arrived on the shores of North America and immediately dictated the terms of global trade through sheer technological supremacy. The reality is that for the first half of the 17th century, the entire French colonial economy was absolutely paralyzed without the explicit consent of a single, highly centralized indigenous banking system. They were the Wendat. The French called them the Huron, and they did not just participate in the fur trade. They engineered it, monopolized it, and held the absolute logistical keys to the continent. History is never what you think. To understand the absolute geopolitical power of the Huron Confederacy, you have to look at the map of 17th century North America, not as an empty, romanticized wilderness, but as a heavily guarded, heavily exploited economic zone. Huronia, or Wendake, was a dense, highly populated peninsula in modern-day Ontario, strategically bordered by the deep waters of Georgian Bay and Lake Simcoe. It functioned as a natural geographical fortress, surrounded by water and dense timber. But the true power of the Huron did not come from hunting beaver in the woods. It came from the dirt. The Huron were a highly advanced agrarian society, operating on an industrial scale. While European cities of the era were drowning in their own filth and starving through the winters, the Huron had engineered 18 massive, organized towns. They cleared tens of thousands of acres of ancient forest to plant vast, mathematically precise fields of corn, beans, and squash. This agricultural machine was so massive that it consumed its own environment. Every 15 to 20 years, the Huron would systematically deplete the nitrogen in the soil, exhaust the surrounding timber required for firewood, and outlast the structural integrity of their wooden palisades and longhouses, which would begin to rot. When that happened, they did not starve. They executed a massive, highly organized civic migration, abandoning the rotting timber and relocating entire cities miles away to fresh soil. In the brutal, unforgiving economy of the northern frontier, corn was not just a food source, it was fiat currency. The nomadic hunter-gatherer tribes of the frozen north, the Algonquin, the Innu, and the Nipissing, could not farm in the frozen granite of the Canadian Shield. They possessed premium, thick winter furs, but they constantly lived on the razor's edge of starvation. The Huron exploited this biological vulnerability with absolute, calculating precision. They produced massive caloric surpluses, storing millions of bushels of dried corn in giant cedar vats inside their fortified longhouses. They traded this excess carbohydrate wealth to the starving northern tribes in exchange for high-grade beaver pelts. The Huron essentially operated as the central bank of the Great Lakes. They hoarded the corn, strictly controlled the exchange rates, and funneled the continental wealth directly into their palisaded cities. When the French established their struggling, freezing colonial outposts along the St. Lawrence River at Quebec, they quickly realized a grim reality. They were completely locked out of the continental interior. They did not conquer the Huron. They submitted to their trade monopoly. The French essentially became the geopolitical vassals of the Huron trade empire. The Huron explicitly forbade the French from bypassing their territory to to trade directly with the northern tribes. If the French wanted a single beaver pelt to ship back to the luxury hat markets of Paris, they had to buy it exclusively through Huron middlemen, at prices dictated entirely by Huron chiefs. The Huron did not trust European paper contracts, and they did not care about the distant authority of the French king. They demanded human collateral. They forced the French to send their young men, the famous coureurs des bois, like Etienne Brulé, to live in Huron longhouses. These Frenchmen were forced to learn the incredibly complex Wendat language, which became the absolute lingua franca of North American trade, and assimilate into indigenous culture just to maintain the alliance. Furthermore, the Huron forced the French military into a strict kinetic contract. If the French wanted the logistics routes to remain open, they had to bleed for them. In 1609, Champlain and his musketeers were obligated to serve as heavy infantry and military advisors in the Hurons' ancient, ongoing territorial wars. Champlain was forced to march south to Lake Champlain and execute opposing chiefs with his matchlock arquebus. He sparked a multi-generational blood feud with the Iroquois Confederacy, entirely to pay the political toll required to secure his commercial lease with the Huron. By the 1630s, the scale of the Huron operation was staggering. It was the premier logistics corporation of the New World, and it ran on sheer human endurance. Every spring, when the river ice finally shattered, a massive, highly synchronized fleet of hundreds of Huron birch-bark canoes would depart Georgian Bay. They descended the brutal, 800-mile gauntlet of the French, Mattawa, and Ottawa rivers. This was not a leisurely paddle. The route contained over 50 lethal rapids. When the water was too violent, the Huron executed portages. Heavily muscled paddlers would beach their canoes, strap 90-pound packs of pelts to their heads, using leather tumplines, and run barefoot over jagged granite and through mosquito-choked swamps, carrying the heavy birch-bark canoes on their shoulders. They did this while heavily armed, guarding their multi-million-franc convoys against ambushes. But monopolies breed desperate enemies. By strictly controlling the flow of northern furs to the French and southern corn to the north, the Huron completely isolated the Iroquois Confederacy, located in modern-day upstate New York. The Iroquois had exhausted the beaver populations in their own territories. To survive the new, globalized economy and purchase European steel, they desperately needed access to the northern hunting grounds. But the Huron blockaded the waterways, violently refusing to let the Iroquois participate in the French trade network. The Iroquois were trapped in an economic desert. They were faced with a grim, existential calculus: break the Huron monopoly, or face total economic and demographic collapse. The military dynamics of the continent shifted violently, not because of tactics, but because of competing European trade policies. When the Dutch established Fort Orange, modern-day Albany, New York, they operated as pure capitalists. They did not care about saving souls or spreading religion. They recognized the strategic value of the Iroquois and began trading high-quality flintlock muskets, lead, and massive kegs of black powder directly to the Mohawk and Seneca in massive quantities. The French, conversely, severely restricted their weapons trade. The Jesuit priests, the Black Robes, operating in Huronia, were given absolute veto power over who received French guns. They rigidly refused to arm any indigenous person unless they officially converted to Catholicism. This disastrous European policy fatally divided the Huron nation. It fractured their internal unity, creating bitter, violent schisms between Christian converts, who held the guns, and traditionalists, who held the political legitimacy. Worse, it left the vast majority of the Huron heavy infantry armed only with wooden slat armor and stone-tipped arrows against Iroquois lead. The ballistic arms race had tipped. and the Huron were already bleeding out from an invisible enemy. Between 1634 and 1640, devastating waves of European smallpox swept through Huronia. The virus performed a targeted demographic eradication, slashing a thriving population of nearly 40,000 people down to barely 10,000. It systematically killed the elders who held the diplomatic knowledge and the veteran military commanders who understood how to defend the Palisades. What followed was not a primitive tribal skirmish. It was a hostile corporate takeover, executed through total, systematic liquidation upon a crippled nation. In the brutal winter of 1648 to 1649, the Iroquois broke every established rule of indigenous warfare. Traditionally, kinetic campaigns were conducted in the summer, when logistics were manageable. But a massive, heavily armed Iroquois strike force of over 1,000 veteran warriors marched north on snowshoes through the deep, freezing drifts of the Ontario winter. They bypassed the usual border skirmishes and struck directly at the heart of the Huron infrastructure. Before dawn on March 16, 1649, they breached the massive wooden walls of the fortified towns of Tainhatan-Taron, St. Ignace, and St. Louis. The Iroquois did not just kill the warriors, they executed a total logistical erasure. They burned the massive storehouses of corn, destroyed the agricultural infrastructure, and shattered the central economic nodes of the empire. They also targeted the European management. They captured the French Jesuit priests, Jean de Brébeuf and Gabriel Lalemant, to send a clear message that the French God could not protect the Huron supply lines. The Iroquois subjected the priests to horrific, calculated torture. They mocked the Catholic sacrament of baptism by pouring boiling water over Brébeuf's head and placed collars of red-hot iron axes around their necks before finally burning them at the stake. The psychological and kinetic shock was absolute. Within a matter of weeks, the remnants of a confederacy that had once controlled the wealth of a continent ceased to exist as a sovereign entity. The survivors burned their own remaining 15 villages to deny the infrastructure and food to the enemy, and scattered into the freezing wilderness. The immediate aftermath was a demographic nightmare. Thousands of Huron refugees fled to Gahohendo, Christian Island, in Georgian Bay, attempting to build a new fortress alongside the surviving French priests. But they had no corn. The Iroquois had burned the agrarian bank. In the freezing winter of 1649 to 1650, the island turned into a starvation camp. Without their massive caloric surpluses, over 3,000 Huron died of malnutrition and exposure in a single season. The island was littered with unburied bodies. The survivors realized that remaining in their homeland was a death sentence. They abandoned the island and fled westward, across the freezing waters of Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, carrying the institutional knowledge of the greatest trade network the continent had ever seen. They reformed, reorganized, and became known as the Wyandot. Though their demographics were shattered, their diplomatic prestige remained deeply intact. When they integrated with the Council of Three Fires, the Odawa-Potawatomi and Ojibwe, the Wyandot became the elder statesmen of the new Western resistance. Because of their ancient legacy as the original masters of the trade, they were granted the immense honor of being the keepers of the council fire for the Western tribes at the strategic choke point of Detroit. They taught the Western tribes the fatal lessons of 1649. Never trust European military promises. Never let religious zealots divide your political infrastructure. And never let an enemy monopolize firearms. The Huron survivors transformed their logistical brilliance into diplomatic leverage. They became the political glue that helped unite the Great Lakes tribes, ultimately forging the very coalition that would, decades later, finally halt the Iroquois war machine in its tracks and push them back to New York. The frontier was never a wild, chaotic void waiting to be tamed by European civilization. It was a highly structured, ruthless economic arena. The Huron built an agrarian bank that dictated the survival of a European colony, only to be violently liquidated when the supply chain of gunpowder shifted against them. When the fires of 1649 burned out, the keys to North America were left in the ashes, waiting for the next syndicate to claim them. On August 16, 1812, an entire American army surrendered without firing a single defensive shot. Inside Fort Detroit, General William Hull stood behind thick timber walls with roughly 2,500 well-supplied soldiers and 33 heavy cannons. Outside waited a combined British and native force roughly half his size. Yet before a single siege trench was dug or a wall breached, Hull raised a white flag, surrendering his men, his artillery, and the entire Michigan territory. How does a fortified garrison collapse before a battle even begins? Later political accounts blamed Hull's personal fear. British military logs called it a stroke of operational fortune. But the historical record reveals a far more deliberate maneuver, a calculated psychological campaign designed to exploit Hull's deepest anxieties. It was orchestrated in part by a Shawnee leader named Tecumseh. In the summer of 1812, Tecumseh mounted arguably the most ambitious attempt to establish a unified Indigenous Confederacy, one that posed a severe strategic threat to the westward expansion of the young United States. History is never what you think. Fort Detroit did not fall in a single afternoon of clever theater. Its surrender began years earlier, deep inside the oak forests of Indiana, born from a desperate struggle for the land itself. To understand why an American general would hand over a fortress without a fight, one must look at the economic demands placed on the Western territories. Following the Revolutionary War, the United States was deeply in debt, holding vast claims to the continent's interior, but little gold or silver. To pay veterans and fund the government, Washington turned the wilderness into capital, selling native hunting grounds in the Old Northwest to incoming settlers. In the Indiana Territory, Governor William Henry Harrison was the agent tasked with acquiring those tracts of land. Harrison did not rely on open military conquest. He exploited deep fractures between villages and generations. He targeted impoverished chiefs, men dependent on trade goods or annual government payments, and pressed them to cede their lands. In the 1809 Treaty of Fort Wayne alone, Harrison acquired 3 million acres of prime forest for roughly 2 cents an acre. Every month, another treaty erased another stretch of river valley from the map. Council fires split into rival factions. Native communities faced a stark reality: accept territorial fragmentation, or find a way to unite before the governor closed the circle. As the treaties eroded their homelands, a profound sense of crisis took hold. Resistance required more than anger. It demanded a spiritual awakening. In 1805, Tecumseh's younger brother, Lalawethika, experienced a series of intense trances. He emerged, took the name Tenskwatawa, the open door, and sparked a sweeping religious revival. Tenskwatawa called for total cultural renewal. He urged his followers to cast off European clothing, throw away iron kettles, and pour trade alcohol into the dirt, identifying the drink as a poison brought to weaken native resolve. Followers gathered by the thousands at a newly established capital, Prophetstown, built precisely where the Wabash and Tippecanoe rivers meet. While Tenskwatawa stirred the spirit, Tecumseh built the political framework. Tecumseh was a highly effective diplomat and a deeply respected strategist. Riding from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf Coast, he brought a single, uncompromising message to every council fire: the land belongs to all indigenous peoples in common. No single chief had the right to sell what belonged to everyone. Under Tecumseh's doctrine, every treaty signed with Harrison was legally void. Tecumseh was attempting something rarely seen on the continent, unifying the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Wyandot, Kickapoo, and the Southern Creek into a single defensive front. If he succeeded, American officials feared the United States would hit an unyielding barrier at the Ohio River. Every mile Tecumseh rode brought the region closer to an explosion. Governor Harrison watched Prophetstown grow, realizing that a unified native front could effectively paralyze Western settlement. In the autumn of 1811, Harrison saw his opening. Tecumseh rode south to recruit among the Creek Nation, leaving strict instructions for his brother to avoid any clash with American troops until the Confederacy was complete. Harrison did not wait. He marched a column of 1,000 regulars and militia directly toward Prophetstown, pitching camp less than a mile from the village gates. The proximity of Harrison's forces created an intolerable tension. On the fog-shrouded morning of November 7, 1811, conflict erupted along the Tippecanoe River. Accounts from the time indicate that Tenskwatawa assured the warriors that spiritual power would protect them from enemy lead. Under cover of darkness, native forces struck Harrison's line. The Battle of Tippecanoe was a bloody, chaotic clash in the brush. The warriors inflicted heavy casualties, but as dawn broke, the disciplined volleys and superior numbers of the American infantry forced a tactical withdrawal. Harrison's troops entered Prophetstown, burned the longhouses, and destroyed the winter food stores. Harrison claimed a decisive victory, using it to launch his national political career. But while Tenskwatawa's religious authority was severely damaged, Tecumseh's political vision survived. Returning to find his capital in ashes, Tecumseh realized he could not defend the region alone. Facing a rapidly expanding American military, he needed an ally with regular infantry and artillery. He turned his eyes north, toward British Canada, setting in motion the exact chain of events that would end at the gates of Fort Detroit. When the United States declared war on Great Britain in June 1812 and invaded Canada, British forces faced grim odds. Major General Sir Isaac Brock, military commander of Upper Canada, was vastly outnumbered. He understood that his small force of regulars could not defend the province alone, and that native mobility, numbers, and knowledge of the terrain would be decisive. Brock was a rare commander for his era. He respected Tecumseh, trusted his military instincts, and treated him as an equal partner in command. When the two men met at Amherstburg, their objective was immediate and singular: Fort Detroit. Inside the fort, General William Hull held 2,500 troops and heavy artillery. Outside, Brock and Tecumseh commanded a force roughly half that size. Brock lacked the numbers for a protracted siege. Tecumseh lacked heavy siege guns. What they shared was a complete understanding of Hull's fears. They launched a coordinated campaign of deception. British officers permitted dispatches to be intercepted, exaggerating the number of northern warriors arriving daily. Brock then sent a formal demand for surrender, containing a chillingly calculated warning: "It is far from my inclination to join in a war of extermination, but you must be aware that the numerous body of Indians who have attached themselves to my troops will be beyond my control the moment the contest commences." Then came the visual theater. Contemporary accounts and later recollections describe Tecumseh marching his warriors past a gap in the tree line in full view of the fort, cycling them back through the dense brush, and marching them past again to inflate their perceived numbers. Inside the fort, Hull watched through his glass as what appeared to be an endless tide of warriors surrounded his position. Paralyzed by the fear of an unbridled assault on his garrison and the civilians sheltered inside, Hull's willingness to fight dissolved. Without a single breach made in the walls, General Hull raised a white flag and surrendered Fort Detroit. Tecumseh's strategy had worked. The Indigenous front Harrison tried to crush at Tippecanoe had just captured the centerpiece of the Northwest. The bloodless capture of Detroit shifted the momentum of the war. Thousands of warriors flocked to Tecumseh's banner, and for over a year, the British-Native partnership successfully held the Western Theater. But this success relied heavily on a fragile command structure. In October 1812, General Brock was killed in action at the Battle of Queenston Heights. His successor, Major General Henry Proctor, was a cautious commander who lacked Brock's daring and held little confidence in his native allies. Trust began to unravel. The crisis came in September 1813, when American forces won the Battle of Lake Erie. Without control of the water, British forces could no longer receive rations or ammunition, effectively cutting off the supply lines to Detroit. Panicked, General Proctor ordered a rapid retreat eastward into Ontario, abandoning Fort Detroit and burning his own supply depots. Tecumseh was furious. He confronted Proctor directly, arguing that retreating abandoned the very lands they had sworn to defend. He famously compared the fleeing general to a frightened animal running from a fight, its tail tucked between its legs. Tecumseh knew that a prolonged retreat would cause his multi-tribal force to scatter. He forced Proctor to turn and make a stand along the Thames River near present-day Chatham, Ontario. On October 5, 1813, the Battle of the Thames began in a swampy oak forest. The British defensive line was poorly prepared. Proctor deployed his exhausted regulars in a thin line across open timber, their artillery rendered useless without proper ammunition. Positioned in the dense swamp to their right were Tecumseh and his warriors, anchoring the flank in the heavy brush. William Henry Harrison, now commanding the American Army of the Northwest, launched a rapid assault using mounted Kentucky volunteers. The demoralized British line shattered within minutes, and General Proctor fled the field. Tecumseh and his warriors stood alone, mounting a stubborn defense in the swamp. Eyewitnesses described intense hand-to-hand fighting through the thick powder smoke. During the engagement, Tecumseh was killed. The exact circumstances of his death remain disputed. Kentucky Colonel Richard Mentor Johnson later claimed to have fired the fatal shot, a claim he leveraged to become Vice President of the United States. Primary accounts conflict, however, and Tecumseh's body was never officially identified by American forces. Following his death, surviving warriors withdrew into the swamp, carrying his body with them. His burial site was kept secret, hidden so effectively that its location remains unknown today. The death of Tecumseh marked the collapse of one of the most formidable indigenous coalitions in North American history. Without his leadership, the Confederacy fractured into isolated factions, and individual tribes were forced to sign away their remaining lands piece by piece. Over the next 2 decades, as American settlements swept across the continent, the Shawnee, Potawatomi, Wyandot, and Ojibwe were systematically dispossessed and driven west of the Mississippi River. Yet Tecumseh's campaign was not merely a tragic prelude to removal. It was a moment when the geopolitical map of North America almost changed forever. He came within a single military partnership of establishing an independent indigenous nation in the center of the continent. As the autumn rain washed the smoke from the swamp along the Thames River, the British regulars retreated, the American army claimed the West, and the warriors melted back into the deep woods, taking the body of Tecumseh with them. They buried him in the dark soil of the region he had fought to save, leaving behind no marker, no monument, and a lingering question of what North America might look like today had he lived. thick, freezing fog rolling off the Great Lakes conceals more than just the gray, turbulent water. Out of the mist, the dark hull of a 30-foot birch bark vessel silently cuts through the chop. It is not a warship. It is a massive freighter, heavily laden with 5 tons of tightly bound cargo, navigating a complex network of rivers that European mapmakers barely knew existed. Most history books construct a false, romanticized narrative when they claim the destiny of North America was decided solely by the flash of European muskets or the brutal, kinetic conquests of the Iroquois. The true empire of the frontier was built not on gunpowder, but on birch bark, caloric mathematics, and the absolute, iron-fisted control of logistical supply chains. Today, we are dissecting the mechanics of the Council of Three Fires, the first true corporate syndicate of the deep woods. It was a perfectly calibrated alliance where the Odawa acted as the chief logistics officers, the Ojibwe operated as the founders and security apparatus, and the Potawatomi drove the manufacturing and political core. They did not just wage war, they dictated economic terms to European monarchs, established a continent-spanning transport monopoly, and held the legendary Iroquois in a geopolitical deadlock. History is never what you think. The formation of this indigenous superpower was not a frantic, accidental alliance of convenience. It was the result of a massive, highly organized demographic migration driven by a mystical directive. Centuries before the first European sails appeared on the horizon, the ancestors of these 3 tribes were a single, unified people known as the Anishinaabe, living along the harsh Atlantic coast. But their society was uprooted by a spiritual mandate, the prophecy of the 7 fires. The elders received a vision ordering them to move west, deep into the uncharted interior of the continent, until they found the place where food grows on water. They marched westward for generations, fighting their way through hostile territories. When this massive migration finally reached the strategic choke point of the Straits of Mackinac, they found their prophecy, Manuman, the wild rice that choked the shallows of the Great Lakes. This rice was not just a food source. It was a dense, highly storable caloric battery that could sustain armies through the lethal northern winters. To maximize their survival and establish total control over this vast new territory, the Anishinaabe executed a calculated division. They deliberately split into 3 distinct branches, each assigned a specific, specialized societal function. The Ojibwe, Chippewa, became the keepers of faith. As the largest demographic group, they held the spiritual center, safeguarding the sacred birch bark scrolls and providing the sheer kinetic manpower required for territorial defense. The Potawatomi became the keepers of the fire. They were tasked with maintaining the sacred council fire and managing the internal political stability of the alliance. The Odawa, Ottawa, became the traders. They were the merchants, the diplomats, and the economic spine of the entire coalition. What made the Council of Three Fires terrifyingly effective was that it operated with a strict division of labor and distinct economic zones. They did not compete for the same resources, they synchronized them. To the north, in the brutal, freezing taiga of Canada and upper Minnesota, were the mobile camps of the Ojibwe. They lived in easily transportable wigwams, highly adapted to a nomadic existence in waist-deep snow. They hunted moose, trapped beaver, and harvested the wild rice. They were the primary extractors of raw materials, specifically the dense, high-quality winter furs demanded by the global market. To the south, in the fertile, loamy soils of Michigan and Indiana, were the Potawatomi. They were a settled agrarian society, living in massive, permanent longhouse villages. They engineered the agricultural engine of the alliance, through the three sisters: corn, beans, and squash. This was not primitive farming. It was an advanced bioengine. The corn provided a stalk for the beans to climb. The beans actively fixed essential nitrogen back into the soil, and the broad squash leaves shaded the ground to retain moisture and kill weeds. They produced massive, sustainable caloric surpluses. And directly in the center, positioned on Manitoulin Island and the Straits of Mackinac, were the Odawa. They established semi-permanent, fortified towns precisely on the most critical aquatic bottlenecks of the continent. By controlling the straits connecting Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, they literally held the gates between the nomadic hunters of the north and the farmers of the south. While other nations exhausted their young men in endless, bloody territorial skirmishes, the Odawa monopolized the waterways. They operated exactly like a modern, multinational logistics corporation. The secret to their dominance was advanced maritime engineering. They designed the Amakuns, small, swift cargo canoes, and the gargantuan Mashun. These massive freight canoes were 10 to 12 meters long, engineered from perfectly stripped birch bark, lashed together with spruce roots, and sealed with boiling pine pitch. When a Mashun hit whitewater rapids, it did not shatter like a rigid European wooden longboat. It flexed and absorbed the kinetic impact. A single Mashun could carry 5 tons of cargo at incredible speeds across open water, yet was light enough to be carried over land portages by a crew of heavily muscled paddlers hauling 90-pound cargo packs on their backs. The Odawa executed a flawless trade triangle. They paddled north, buying raw furs from the Ojibwe hunters. They paddled south, trading some of those furs to the Potawatomi for thousands of pounds of dried corn and highly durable woven reed mats. They loaded their massive freighters to the brim and drove these aquatic convoys down the Ottawa River directly to the French colonial ports of Montreal. The struggling French colony of New France did not survive because of the strategic brilliance of King Louis's ministers. New France survived exclusively because the Odawa signed a logistical contract to supply them. The Odawa held the absolute monopoly on transport. If you wanted goods moved in North America, you paid their rates. Because they controlled the economy, they controlled the politics. The Odawa were the undisputed diplomats of the frontier. They did not possess a written alphabet, but they utilized a system far more binding: wampum. To the Europeans, belts of woven purple and white quahog shells looked like primitive jewelry. To the Council of Three Fires, a wampum belt was a highly complex, legally binding document. Carving and drilling these shells with stone tools required thousands of hours of meticulous labor, making the belts a true fiat currency, backed by human sweat. It was a diplomatic ledger, recording treaties, trade agreements, and military alliances. An Odawa ambassador, carrying the correct wampum, wielded more geopolitical power than a French general carrying a musket. When the Iroquois Confederacy launched the devastating Beaver Wars, burning the Huron nation to the ground, it was the Odawa who organized the diplomatic and economic resistance. They forged a massive coalition of Western tribes. They knew how to negotiate, how to stall, and how to leverage their supply lines to starve the enemy of resources. When the monumental Great Peace of Montreal was signed in 1701, the treaty that finally halted the expansion of the Iroquois Empire, there were no European-style signatures. Instead, the totem marks, the dudems, of the Odawa chiefs, such as the bear and the fox, sat at the very top of the document, representing a unified front of 40 indigenous nations. They sat across the table from French governors, not as conquered subjects, but as top-tier corporate executives, dictating the price of beaver pelts and drawing the borders of empires. But the Council of Three Fires was not destroyed by a sudden, overwhelming cavalry charge. It was dismantled by an internal logistical crisis and the cynical, shifting priorities of colonial legislation. The collapse occurred in three distinct phases. First was the fatal injection of industrial dependency. By relying heavily on the European trade, the Confederacy gradually lost its self-sufficiency. They forgot how to knap flint or fire clay, replacing their pots with brass kettles and their bows with flintlocks. They effectively outsourced their entire manufacturing base to Europe. When European monarchs arbitrarily changed the terms of trade, or when ammunition shipments were delayed by overseas wars, the economy of the Three Fires fractured. Second was the geopolitical wedge, driven by the shifting borders of empires. The British played a cynical double game, encouraging indigenous resistance against the Americans, but refusing to bleed for them. This betrayal culminated in 1794, when the British literally locked the gates of Fort Miamis on retreating indigenous warriors after the Battle of Fallen Timbers. It was the newly formed United States that then forced the aggressive territorial compromises of the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. This created a bitter internal schism. The pragmatic Odawa and Potawatomi recognized the shifting demographics and leaned toward negotiation. This drew the absolute fury of the radical, combat-ready Ojibwe, who demanded a war of attrition. The ironclad unity of the council cracked over the fundamental question of whether to fight to the death or compromise to survive. The final blow was delivered by the legislative machinery of the United States. Following the Indian Removal Act of 1830, the U.S. government utilized a ruthless divide-and-conquer tactic. They refused to recognize the Council of Three Fires as a unified entity. They isolated individual bands and chiefs, coercing them into separate, fraudulent treaties. The agrarian Potawatomi were violently uprooted from their fertile lands. In the freezing November of 1838, under the guard of armed militias, they were forced on a brutal death march to the desolate prairies of Kansas, a tragedy remembered as the Potawatomi Trail of Death, where typhus and exposure decimated their ranks. The Ojibwe were compressed into tiny, isolated reservations in the frozen bogs of the north. And the Odawa, the great merchants of the lakes, lost their highway. The opening of the Erie Canal in 1825 and the rapid proliferation of steam-powered paddle wheelers rendered their massive birch-bark freighters instantly obsolete. A journey that took the Odawa weeks could now be done by industrial steamers in days. Their transport monopoly was permanently erased by the Industrial Revolution. The Council of Three Fires demonstrated to the world that the frontier was not conquered solely by savagery and kinetic violence. It was conquered by intellect, organization, and logistics. They engineered a system where the specialized skills of three distinct nations, operating with total internal autonomy, synchronized to control half a continent. Their story is not a simple tragedy of defeat. It is a masterclass in economic leverage, diplomacy, and incredible resilience, a logistical legacy that still endures in the bloodline of their descendants today. History is a ledger of supply and demand, and for over a century, the Council of Three Fires held the pen.